At 22, Elara had already lost her father, lost her home, and lost the thread of the person she was supposed to be becoming. All her stepmother, a woman of sharp angles and quiet calculations, left her was a derelict radio station on the edge of town, a place the world called worthless, bought for the legal necessity of $1, and Beatrice, flanked by her lawyer and a man with a developer's smile, had laughed. A thin, dry sound like paper tearing, but what nobody knew, what Beatrice in her hurry to liquidate a life had overlooked, was what her father Silas used to say while cleaning the delicate filaments of an old vacuum tube, his voice a low hum against the ever-present static of the building. Some signals, he'd say, you don't hear with your ears. That, though, comes later. First, there was the silence, the specific, hollowed-out silence that comes after a funeral, when the last of the casserole dishes have been returned and the sympathetic phone calls dwindle to nothing. The house she grew up in, a place once filled with the smell of solder and ozone and her father's pipe tobacco, now smelled only of Beatrice's expensive, joyless perfume. It was a smell that erased things. The furniture, once worn into comfortable shapes by years of use, was now draped in white sheets, waiting for appraisal, for removal, for its conversion into a number on a page. Beatrice moved through the house not like a grieving widow, but like an executor, her steps brisk, her voice devoid of the soft edges of sorrow. She had a checklist. She had a pen. Elara, sitting on the bottom stair, felt like just another item to be marked off. The meeting in the lawyer's office was short and brutal. Mr. Gable, a man who had known her father for 30 years, could not meet her eye. He stared at a spot on his mahogany desk, his face a mask of professional regret. The will was read in a monotone. The house, the savings, the investments, the car. It all went to Beatrice. It was, the lawyer explained, a standard will for a second marriage designed for maximum efficiency. The word hung in the air, efficiency, as if a life was a machine to be dismantled with the fewest possible movements. Elara was left with her father's personal effects, his clothes, which still smelled of him, his books, many with his notes scribbled in the margins, and a small wooden box of radio tubes he had collected over a lifetime. And then there was the station, WSKR. The call letters stood for nothing, a relic from a time before acronyms needed to mean something. It sat on 2 acres of undesirable land out by the marsh, its broadcast tower a rust-red skeleton against the gray sky. It hadn't broadcast a signal in 5 years, not since the last of its ancient equipment had finally given up. It was, Mr. Gable explained, a net liability. The property taxes were in arrears. The building itself was likely in violation of a dozen town codes. Beatrice made a show of magnanimity. She could, she said, simply let the town seize it for back taxes. But she wanted a clean break. She would sell it to Elara. For $1. The developer, a man named Croft with a smile that never reached his eyes, chuckled. $1 for 2 acres of prime future development? He said, winking at Beatrice. Generous. It was a joke they shared, a joke at her expense. The dollar was an insult, a way of assigning a final, public value to the one thing her father had loved purely, stubbornly, irrationally. It was a way of saying, this is what his legacy is worth. Nothing. Less than nothing. Elara pushed the single, folded bill across the desk. Her hand did not shake. She signed the papers where Mr. Gable's finger pointed. She did not speak. There were no words for the cold fury that was hardening in her chest, a feeling so new and sharp it almost felt like hope. She took the keys, a single, rusty thing on a loop of frayed wire, and walked out of the office into the thin afternoon light. She didn't look back. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their pity and their dismissal. Let them laugh. They saw a falling down building on a patch of worthless ground. They saw a girl with nothing. They had measured her inheritance and found it wanting. But her father had taught her to measure things differently. Measure twice, cut once, he'd always said, a simple carpenter's maxim he applied to everything. They had only measured once. They had measured in dollars, in square feet, in potential profit. They had not listened for the other signals. They had not seen the faint, steady glow of the one small tube he had given her years ago, a keepsake she kept on her nightstand. It was an old Kenrad, its glass warm to the touch, and unlike the others, it had never burned out. It just kept glowing, a soft amber light in the darkness. A promise, a signal she was only just beginning to learn how to read. The town remembered Silas as a kind of ghost, a man out of time. He was the keeper of a dead thing, the radio station that played music for no one. In the last years, before the main transmitter finally went dark, you could drive past the squat cinderblock building by the marsh and hear the faint, tinny strains of music from a bygone era. Songs of love and loss from the 40s and 50s, crackling through the air like messages from a distant star. People would smile, shake their heads. "There goes old Silas," they'd say, "still fighting the last war." Arthur, who ran the electronics repair shop on Main Street, knew differently. His shop was an archive of its own, a museum of planned obsolescence, with shelves full of gutted televisions and disemboweled record players. He was a small, neat man who smelled of flux and hot dust, and he had been Silas's only real friend. "Your father wasn't living in the past, Alara," he said to her one afternoon, a week after the signing. He was bent over a circuit board, his soldering iron letting out a small hiss of blue smoke. He was listening to it. He set the iron in its cradle and looked at her over the top of his spectacles. People thought he was just spinning records. He wasn't. He was archiving. Said the whole town was losing its memory, one funeral at a time. He said someone had to catch the stories before they evaporated. Ilara sat on a stool, the rusty key to the station turning over and over in her hand. She remembered her father at the main console, his large, gentle hands moving over the dials and switches with a surgeon's grace. He would lean close to the microphone, his voice a low, soothing baritone. But he wasn't talking to an audience. He was talking to the equipment itself, coaxing it, encouraging it. He called it the echo, Arthur continued, wiping his hands on a rag. He believed every story ever told in this town was still out there, bouncing around in the ether. Faint signals. He spent years building filters, amplifiers, things to pull those voices out of the noise. He gestured to a dusty amplifier on a high shelf. "That's one of his. Looks like junk, right? Thing can pick up a whisper in a hurricane." This was the man Beatrice had erased so efficiently. A man who saw a radio station not as a business, but as a listening post for ghosts. A man who believed memory was a physical substance, as real as radio waves, something that could be captured, saved. Beatrice, by contrast, saw only the future. A future paved over, neatly zoned, and profitable. She had invited Ilara to the house one last time, to collect the boxes of her father's things. The developer, Croft, was there again, unrolling a set of blueprints across the dining room table where Ilara had done her homework as a child. "We just wanted to make you an offer," Beatrice began, her voice smooth and reasonable. "A courtesy." Croft pointed a manicured finger at the blueprint. "We'll be breaking ground on the new retail plaza in 6 months. Your property is right in the middle of the planned entrance." He smiled that empty smile. "It's an eyesore, frankly, and a liability. We'd be doing you a favor, taking it off your hands." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a formal offer, $5,000. "That's more than fair," Beatrice added. "It's more than it's worth. The demolition costs alone will be twice that." Ilara looked at the number. $5,000. It felt like a second insult, a confirmation of the first. They weren't just buying the land. They were buying her compliance, her silence. They were trying to pay her to agree with them that her father's life's work was garbage. "The tower will have to come down, of course," Croft said, almost as an afterthought. "It's a hazard. and an obstruction to the new signage. The tower. The great, rust-red skeleton that had been the backdrop to her entire life. She remembered her father climbing it once a year, a small figure moving slowly up into the sky to check the connections, to keep the signal strong. It wasn't just a tower. It was a monument to his belief, to his stubborn, beautiful faith in the unseen. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a slammed door. Beatrice's smile tightened at the corners. "Elara, don't be sentimental. It's a pile of bricks and rust. Take the money. It's a fresh start." "It's his," Elara said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it had. "And now it's mine." Croft rolled up the blueprints with a snap. His patience, a thin veneer, was gone. "Fine, have it your way. But the town has codes, condemnation orders. Things can get very expensive for a young woman with no income." It was a threat wrapped in politeness, a promise of the bureaucratic war to come. He was telling her that they had the power and the money to crush her, to bury the station under a pile of permits and fines until she had no choice but to surrender. He saw a weak, grieving girl, an obstacle to be removed. He did not see the daughter of Silas. He did not see the quiet resolve that was now cooling into steel in her veins. She picked up the last box of her father's books and walked to the door. She paused on the threshold and looked back at the woman who had shared her father's bed, but never his heart. "He used to say a place isn't the land it's on," Elara said, the words coming to her as if from a great distance. "It's the stories it holds." Beatrice just stared at her, her expression unreadable, a perfect mask of polite confusion. She didn't understand. She never would. The station smelled of time. Not the musty, stagnant scent of a forgotten attic, but the layered, complex smell of a place where a single, focused life had been lived. There was the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the old transformers, the warm, dusty fragrance of vacuum tubes that had been hot for 1,000 hours, the faint, sweet aroma of her father's pipe tobacco embedded in the wood-paneled walls, and underneath it all, the damp, earthy breath of the marsh seeping in through the foundation. The air was thick with it, a physical presence. Elara unlocked the door with the rusty key, the sound of the tumblers turning echoing loudly in the silence. Light from the single grimy window cut a dusty stripe across the floor of the main broadcast room. Everything was just as he had left it. The big Western electric console stood like an altar in the center of the room, its rows of knobs and switches coated in a fine gray dust. A coffee cup, stained brown on the inside, sat next to a dog-eared copy of a technical manual. On the wall, a calendar was still turned to a month that was 3 years gone. It was a time capsule of the day the signal died. She ran a hand along the cool metal edge of the console, her fingers leaving clean trails in the dust. This was his kingdom. A small, cluttered room where he had tried to hold back the silence. She felt closer to him here than she had in the sterile, sheet-draped house she no longer recognized. She was not alone. A flicker of movement in the shadows under the console caught her eye. 2 green eyes blinked at her, slowly. A cat, thin and gray, with a torn ear, emerged and gave a tentative meow. Elara knelt down. She remembered this cat, a stray that had started hanging around the station years ago. Her father had named him Static and had left out food and water, turning the wild thing into a silent, watchful companion. Static seemed to remember her, or at least the scent of her father that clung to her. He rubbed against her leg, a low purr rumbling in his chest. He was a piece of the place, another living echo. He had stayed. He had kept vigil. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Elara would arrive in the morning, Static greeting her at the door. She would work for hours, cleaning, sorting, trying to understand the cartography of her father's world. She started with the record library, thousands of vinyl albums lining the walls of a back room, a vast encyclopedia of forgotten melodies. She cleaned each one, her hands growing black with dust, feeling the weight of them, the history in their grooves. In the afternoons, Arthur would sometimes stop by, bringing a thermos of coffee and a sandwich. He wouldn't say much. He'd just sit on a stool, watching her work, offering a quiet piece of advice about a particular piece of equipment or telling a story about her father. "He saved everything," Arthur said one day, gesturing at a wall of metal filing cabinets. Broadcast logs, maintenance reports, letters from the 3 people who were still listening at the end. Arthur was the station's other witness, the keeper of the community's memory. He held the stories that hadn't yet been told, providing the context for the strange artifacts Ilara was unearthing. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the room, Ilara found herself standing before the main transmitter. It was a massive thing, a floor-to-ceiling cabinet of steel and glass, filled with tubes the size of milk bottles. It was the heart of the station, the source of the power that had sent her father's signal out into the world. It was cold now, silent. But as she stood there, she felt something. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from the floor near its base. She knelt and placed her palm against the concrete. It was definitely warmer here. A small, distinct patch of warmth in the otherwise cold room. Static, who had been following her around, came over and curled up directly on the spot, his purr growing louder, a contented, rumbling sound. He seemed to know this place. He had chosen it. Ilara looked from the cat to the transmitter, then to the wall behind it. She had a sudden, overwhelming sense that she was on the edge of something, a secret the room had been waiting to tell her. Her father was a meticulous man. Everything in the station, from the neatly coiled cables to the labeled drawers of spare parts, spoke of his order, his precision. But the wall behind the transmitter, it was different, an anomaly, a single, discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. And that was where the cat slept, curled on a patch of warm floor, as if guarding a hidden door. The wall was wrong. It was a small thing, something a person in a hurry would never notice. Beatrice would never have seen it. Croft, with his eyes full of dollar signs and blueprints, would have dismissed it as shoddy construction. But Ilara had her father's eyes. She had been taught to look for the seams, for the places where things joined together. The baseboard along the bottom of the wall behind the transmitter didn't quite match the rest of the room. The wood was a slightly different color, the cut of the edge a little less precise. The plaster above it, too, had a different texture, smoother, as if applied by a different hand. She spent a whole day just looking at it, running her hands over its surface, tapping it lightly with her knuckles. Most of it sounded solid, a dull thud. But in one section, low to the ground near the warm spot where Static slept, the sound was different. It was hollow. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She went to the filing cabinets Arthur had pointed out. They were filled with decades of broadcast logs, neatly organized by year. She pulled out the most recent ones, from the final years of the station's life. At first, they seemed normal. Lists of songs, times, and dates, all recorded in her father's neat, blocky handwriting. But as she looked closer, she started to see another pattern. Sprinkled among the song titles were strange entries. Not music, but strings of numbers and letters. A4-T7-Echo. B9-R2- signal. And next to some of them, a single word, archived. They were codes. A secret language hidden in plain sight. She cross-referenced the dates of the coded entries with her father's maintenance logs. On many of those same days, there were notes about transmitter calibration, about boosting the signal on a specific low frequency, a frequency far below the standard AM broadcast band. He wasn't just playing records, he was doing something else, something that required immense power and precision. He was using the entire station, the tower, the transmitter, as a giant secret instrument. Static watched her from his warm spot on the floor, his green eyes following her every move. He seemed to be waiting, a patient, silent guide. He would occasionally get up, stretch, and rub against the hollow-sounding spot on the wall before settling back down. He was showing her, "This is the place. Look here." The feeling was so strong, so insistent, that she couldn't ignore it. She found her father's old toolbox, the wooden one he had built himself, its contents laid out in a perfect, ordered landscape of steel and wood. She took out a pry bar and a hammer. For a moment, she hesitated. This felt like a violation, like breaking into a tomb. But the memory of Croft's smug smile, of Beatrice's cold dismissal, pushed her forward. This wasn't destruction, it was an excavation. She started at the baseboard, gently working the pry bar into the seam. The wood groaned in protest, then came away with a splintering crack. Behind it, just as she suspected, was not concrete block, but plasterboard. She used the hammer to knock a small hole, the sound cannoning through the quiet station. Peering inside, she saw only darkness. But she could feel a draft of cool, dry air on her face. There was a space back there, a hidden space. With her heart pounding, she worked for the next hour, pulling away chunks of plaster and wood, the dust filling the air, until she had created an opening large enough to crawl through. Static sat just outside the hole, watching, as if to say, "It's about time." She grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox and slid through the opening, her clothes catching on the rough edges of the broken plaster. She was in a small, narrow corridor, no wider than her shoulders. It ran the length of the wall. And it was not empty. She swept the beam of the flashlight across the space, and her breath caught in her throat. Lining the far wall, from floor to ceiling, were shelves. And on the shelves were not boxes of money, not gold, not jewels. It was something far stranger and far more precious. There were rows upon rows of reel-to-reel tape machines, dozens of them, all neatly arranged and labeled with the same codes from the broadcast logs. Below them were hundreds of metal boxes, each one containing a tape. And on the bottom shelves, there were devices. Strange, handmade electronic devices she had never seen before. They were small, wooden boxes, beautifully crafted, with a single microphone and a simple on-off switch. There were at least 100 of them. This was her father's secret, his real work. The music was a cover. The station was a front. This hidden room, this secret archive, was his life's true purpose. The fortune behind the wall wasn't something you could spend. It was something you had to listen to. And as she stood there, in the quiet, dusty dark, she had the distinct feeling that it was about to speak. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where the quiet work done in the shadows is dragged into the light. It is the part where a legacy, dismissed as worthless, reveals its true and immeasurable value. It is the part where the underestimated find their voice, and the powerful are forced, for the first time, to listen. Alara spent the next few days in a kind of trance, moving between the main broadcast room and the hidden corridor. She brought one of the reel-to-reel players out and set it up on the main console. She cleaned the heads, threaded a tape from one of the metal boxes, and flipped a switch. The reels began to turn, slowly, silently at first. Then, a voice filled the room. It was not a radio announcer. It was not a singer. It was the voice of a man, old and frail, his words punctuated by a soft, wheezing breath. And my father, he looked at that river coming up over the banks, and he didn't even hesitate. He took the last boat, the leaky one nobody wanted, and he went back for the Millers, who were trapped in their attic. Everyone said he was a fool, but he came back with all 3 of them, just as the water took their roof. The voice cracked with an emotion that was 80 years old. Alara felt tears welling in her eyes. She knew that story. It was the story of the Great Flood of '38. But she had only ever read about it in the dry, factual accounts of the local newspaper archives. She had never heard it like this. She played another tape. A woman's voice this time, sharp and clear, telling the story of the first day the town's main factory opened, the hope and the fear and the smell of the new machinery. Then another, a man describing what it was like to see the first car drive down Main Street. And another. And another. It was a chorus of ghosts. It was the town's memory, its soul, captured on magnetic tape. Her father had not been listening for echoes in the ether. He had been creating them. The strange wooden boxes she had found were high-fidelity, long-life recording devices. He must have been giving them to people, the town's elders, asking them to tell their stories. The coded entries in the logs mark the times when he had used the transmitter, not to broadcast music, but to send a low-frequency activation signal to the recorders, and then a retrieval signal to pull their recordings back to the station through the airwaves. A secret, invisible net catching memories before they could fade. He had built a secret, wireless oral history archive. He had saved them all. She found a ledger tucked behind the tapes. In it, in his same neat hand, were names, dates, and the code for each corresponding tape. Hundreds of names, many of them she recognized. People who had passed away years ago. The butcher, the baker, the librarian, the farmer. The people who had built the town, whose lives were the foundation of everything, and who were now just fading names on headstones. He had saved their voices. He had saved their stories. She finally understood the warm spot on the floor. The main power conduit for the transmitter ran directly beneath that spot. When he was pulling in the signals, it would have generated a tremendous amount of heat. Static hadn't been guarding a door. He had been sleeping on the warm heart of his master's secret work. The revelation was so immense, so profound, that for a time she forgot all about Beatrice and Croft. She was immersed in the past, in the river of voices her father had curated. But the present has a way of asserting itself, often with a piece of paper and a threat. The notice was taped to the station's front door. It was a bright, angry orange. An official condemnation order from the town. It listed a dozen fictitious code violations: faulty wiring, structural instability, improper zoning. It gave her 30 days to either bring the building up to code, an impossible task requiring tens of thousands of dollars, or face demolition. At the bottom was the signature of the town's compliance officer, but Ilara knew whose hands had truly guided the pen. It was Croft's move. The war he had promised had begun. The 30-day deadline wasn't a warning. It was a clock, ticking down to the destruction of everything she had just found. They weren't just trying to tear down a building. They were trying to tear down an entire library of souls. For the first time since her father's death, a hot, pure anger burned through her grief. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated her father. And they had no idea what they were about to unleash. She looked at the shelves of tapes, at the rows of silent voices waiting to be heard. They had left her a pile of bricks and rust. They thought they had left her with nothing. They were wrong. They had left her an army. The clock was ticking. Each day that passed felt shorter than the one before, the shadow of the demolition deadline stretching longer across the floor of the station. Ilara worked with a frantic, focused energy she didn't know she possessed. She slept on a cot in the control room, waking in the middle of the night to the hum of the old equipment she was slowly, painstakingly bringing back to life. The voices from the tapes were her constant companions, a chorus of encouragement from the past. She ate sandwiches Arthur brought her, barely tasting them, her mind on circuit diagrams and signal paths. He watched her, a worried frown creasing his forehead. "You can't fight them, Ilara," he said gently one evening, gesturing toward the orange notice still taped to the door. "They have the money, the lawyers. They own the town council." "My father built this place to save things," she said, not looking up from a tangle of wires she was soldering. "I'm not going to let them tear it down to sell cheap plastic." She knew he was right, though. She couldn't win a legal battle. She had no money, no influence. All she had were the voices. All she had was the truth. She kept searching the hidden room, convinced there had to be more, some final piece of the puzzle her father had left for her. She ran her hands over every box, every shelf. And then she found it. It was the last box on the highest shelf, tucked away in the darkest corner. It was identical to all the others, labeled with a code she didn't recognize from the logs. But it felt different, lighter. Inside, there was no tape. There was only a single sealed envelope, and resting on top of it, the small Kenrad vacuum tube from her childhood, the one that had always glowed on her nightstand. She realized with a jolt that it had gone missing from the house after her father's death. He had put it here. For her. A key. A beacon. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. On the front, in his familiar handwriting, was a single word. Ilara. It was a letter from the dead. She sat at the main console, the one place in the world she felt his presence most strongly, and carefully broke the seal. The letter was not long. It was written on the station's official letterhead, the ink slightly faded. "My dearest Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you found your way past the silence. I always knew you would. You have my eyes. You know how to look for the seams. I am sorry to have left this burden to you, but I could not trust it to anyone else. What you have found is the echo. It is my life's real work. I started it when your grandmother died. I was so afraid of forgetting the sound of her voice, the stories she used to tell. I realized then that a town is not a collection of buildings, but a collection of voices. When those voices fall silent, the town dies, even if the buildings are still standing. So I built this, a lifeboat for memories. The devices are for listening, the transmitter is for gathering, the tapes are the cargo. I ask that you protect it, not for me, but for them. For the people on the tapes, and for the people who have not yet been born, who will need to know where they came from. Some will tell you it is worthless. They will measure it in dollars and tell you to sell. Do not listen to them. Worth is not the same as price. There is a town council meeting on the 15th of next month to approve the new retail development. They will try to condemn the station. Do not let them. You have the voices now. Let them speak. A place isn't the land it's on. It's the stories it holds. This place holds them all. Be brave. I love you. Dad. She folded the letter, her tears falling onto the dry, brittle paper. It was not a burden. It was a gift. It was permission, a purpose, a map for the rest of her life. He had known, somehow, that it would come to this. He had known she would be tested, and he had left her the only weapon she would need. The date of the town council meeting was in 2 days. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The demolition order. The 30-day deadline. It was all designed to run out just after the council meeting, giving her no time to appeal, no chance to fight back once the developer's plans were approved. It was a neat, tidy, legal execution. She looked from the letter to the tape player, then to the wall of silent, waiting stories. Her father had asked her to be brave. He had asked her to let them speak. And that is exactly what she was going to do. She wasn't going to hire a lawyer. She wasn't going to file an injunction. She was going to walk into that meeting with a tape recorder, and she was going to turn the whole damn room into a radio station. The town council meeting was held in the old municipal building, a stuffy room with water-stained ceilings and rows of unforgiving wooden chairs. It was a place designed for bureaucratic procedure, not for emotional revelation. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and quiet desperation. Ilara sat in the back row, a small, portable reel-to-reel player on her lap. It was one of her father's, its wooden case worn smooth with use. She had spent the last 48 hours choosing the tapes, listening to dozens of voices, weaving them together into a single, undeniable narrative. She felt strangely calm. The fear she had been carrying for weeks had been burned away by the simple clarity of her purpose. She was no longer just Ilara, the grieving daughter. She was the librarian of the echo. She was the keeper of the voices. Beatrice and Croft sat in the front row with their lawyer, radiating an aura of confident ownership. They chatted with the council chairman, a man named Thompson, whose campaign had been generously funded by Croft's development company. They looked like they were merely there to witness the final, foregone conclusion of a business deal. They did not even glance in her direction. They had already dismissed her. The meeting began, a tedious drone of minutes being approved and budgets being discussed. Alara's hands rested on the tape player. She could feel the faint vibration of its motor, a sleeping heartbeat. Finally, the chairman announced the agenda item: discussion and vote on the proposed Northgate Retail Plaza development and the associated condemnation of property 714, the old WSKR station. Croft walked to the podium, all smooth confidence and expensive tailoring. He unrolled his blueprints and began his presentation, his voice painting a picture of progress and prosperity. He spoke of jobs, of tax revenue, of a bright, modern future for the town. He used words like revitalization and opportunity. He referred to the station as a dilapidated structure, an eyesore, and a barrier to progress. He made it sound so reasonable, so logical. He was erasing her father's life with a PowerPoint presentation. The property owner has been given ample opportunity to address the numerous code violations, he concluded, with a brief, dismissive nod in her direction, but has failed to do so. We ask that the council vote to approve the development and finalize the condemnation order so that we can move forward with this exciting new chapter for our town. The council members nodded, their minds clearly already made up. The chairman looked out over the room. "Is there anyone who wishes to speak on this matter?" he asked, his tone suggesting the question was a mere formality. A beat of silence. Then, Ilara stood up. "I would," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still room. All eyes turned to her. She saw surprise on Croft's face, annoyance on Beatrice's. The chairman sighed. "You have 3 minutes." She walked to the podium, placing the tape player on the wooden surface. She did not look at the council. She did not look at Croft or Beatrice. She looked at the handful of townspeople scattered in the audience, their faces weary and familiar. "My father was Silas Cole," she began. "Most of you knew him. You knew him as the man who ran the old radio station. You thought he was playing music for no one. You were wrong." She pressed the play button. The first voice that filled the room was reedy and thin, but full of a fierce pride. It was the voice of Mrs. Gable, the town lawyer's own grandmother, who had passed away 5 years prior. "My Henry," the voice crackled. "He wasn't a fancy man. He laid every brick on Main Street with his own 2 hands. He used to say, 'You don't build a town with money, you build it with calluses and good mortar.' People forget that." Mr. Gable, sitting next to Beatrice, flinched as if he'd been struck. His face went pale. Ilara let the voice hang in the air for a moment. Then she stopped the tape. "My father believed that a place isn't the land it's on. He said it's the stories it holds. For the last 20 years of his life, he collected those stories. He saved them. That station isn't a dilapidated structure. It's an archive. It's our archive." She pressed play again. A new voice, a deep baritone this time. It was the old fire chief, a man legendary for his heroism. He told the story of the mill fire of '62, of pulling 3 children from the flames. He named them by name. One of them was the father of a woman now sitting on the town council. The councilwoman's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Ilara played another snippet, and another. A woman describing the day the soldiers came home from the war. A man talking about his first harvest on a farm that had long since been paved over. It was a symphony of the town's own history, a flood of memories they had forgotten they even had. The room was utterly silent, all pretense of a formal meeting gone. People were leaning forward, listening, their faces a mixture of awe and grief. They were hearing the voices of their parents, their grandparents, their lost friends. They were hearing the sound of their own roots. The final voice Ilara played was different. It was a woman, her voice thick with regret. "And I never went to see him," the voice whispered, frail and full of static. "I was always so busy. My new life, my new husband. I told myself he was fine, an old man with his old hobbies. I told myself I'd go next week. And then there were no more weeks left. I never told him. I never told my own father. Ilara stopped the tape. She looked directly at Croft, the developer. His face was ashen. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, naked shock. Everyone in the room who was old enough knew the voice of his mother, a woman who had died alone in a nursing home 2 towns over, while her son was busy building his empire. The silence in the room was no longer procedural. It was heavy, accusatory. It was the sound of a truth landing with unbearable weight. Croft stood frozen, exposed not by an argument or a legal challenge, but by the ghost of his own neglected mother. Beatrice stared at him, her perfect composure finally cracking, a look of pure fury in her eyes that he had allowed this to happen, that he had failed to control the situation. The spell was broken. The carefully constructed narrative of progress and profit had been shattered by the simple, undeniable power of memory. Then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Gable, the lawyer, stood up. His face was blotched red, his hands shaking. He looked at the council, at the townspeople, at Ilara. "She's right," he said, his voice thick. "That was my grandmother. I had forgotten what she sounded like." He took a deep breath, a man making a decision that would change the course of his life. The condemnation order is a sham. The violations listed are exaggerations, and, in some cases, complete fabrications. A gasp went through the room. Beatrice shot to her feet. "Mr. Gable, I advise you to be silent," she hissed. But he ignored her. He was no longer her lawyer. He was Henry Gable's grandson. "Mr. Croft and his client," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "pressured me to sign off on that order. They told me it was a formality. They told me no one would care about that old place. They were wrong. I was wrong." He turned to Ilara, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "What your father did, it's a treasure. I can't be a party to destroying it." He walked to the podium and placed his briefcase on it. "As of this moment, I am resigning as counsel for this project, and I would like to offer my services, pro bono, to Miss Cole, to help her establish the WSKR station as a historical trust for the permanent preservation of the Echo Archive." The room erupted. Not in applause, but in a low murmur of assent, of a community waking up. The council members were looking at each other, then at Croft, their expressions shifting from complicity to dawning horror. They had almost voted to bulldoze their own history. Chairman Thompson, his face pale, banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" But there was no order to be had. The truth was out, and it was loud, and it was messy. Croft, without another word, turned and walked quickly out of the room, a man fleeing the scene of his own public execution. Beatrice stood alone for a moment, her face a mask of cold fury, before following him out, defeated. Ilara watched them go, but she felt no triumph, only a quiet, somber sense of justice. The voices had spoken, and the town, after so many years of silence, had finally listened. The vote, when it finally came, was a mere formality. The development proposal was denied. The condemnation order was rescinded. The station was safe. As Ilara packed up her father's tape player, people started to approach her, one by one. An old man, his eyes wet with tears, touched her arm. "That was my brother," he whispered. "The one who talked about the harvest. I haven't heard his voice in 40 years. A woman gave her a piece of paper with her phone number on it. "My mother is on one of those tapes," she said. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call me." They were not just thanking her, they were claiming their history. They were rejoining their family. The found family her father had so carefully, so secretly, preserved. The days after the council meeting were a blur of quiet activity. The story of what had happened, of the voices on the tapes, spread through the town like a slow, warm fire. There were no newspaper articles, no television reports. It was passed from person to person, over coffee, across fence lines, in the aisles of the grocery store. It was a story that belonged to them, and they kept it close. The first person to show up at the station was the councilwoman whose father's life had been saved in the mill fire. She arrived in a pickup truck with her 2 teenage sons, carrying buckets and sponges. She didn't say much. She just started washing the grime from the station's windows. "We thought you could use a hand," was all she said. By the end of that week, there was a small crowd. The owner of the hardware store dropped off gallons of paint. The baker from Main Street brought fresh bread and coffee every morning. A retired electrician spent 3 days voluntarily rewiring the entire building, bringing it up to code, his face a mask of intense concentration. They were a silent, purposeful army, repaying a debt to a man who had never asked for anything. They took down the orange condemnation notice and painted the front door a bright, welcoming blue. They fixed the leaky roof. They planted flowers in the dirt patch out front. They were not restoring a building. They were tending to a shrine. Mr. Gable was true to his word. He handled all the legal work, drawing up the papers to create the WSKR Echo Archive, a non-profit trust dedicated to the preservation and continuation of Silas's work. He worked with the same meticulous care his grandfather had used to lay the bricks on Main Street. Ilara watched it all with a sense of quiet wonder. She had spent so long feeling alone, an island of grief. Now she was surrounded by a family she had never known she had. They were not bound by blood, but by a shared history, by the voices on the tapes. They were the family who showed up. Beatrice was never seen in town again. The house was sold to a family with young children, and the sound of laughter returned to its rooms. Crofts Development Company quietly withdrew all its proposals, and its name became a quiet curse, a synonym for greed and forgetting. They had been erased, not by anger, but by the simple, steady work of remembrance. Ilara's purpose was clear now. She and a team of volunteers, led by Arthur from the repair shop, began the monumental task of digitizing the tapes. They set up workstations in the main broadcast room, the air now filled with the soft whir of computers and the chorus of voices being brought into a new century. Each recording was a revelation, a window into a lost world. They heard recipes for pies, remedies for colds, lullabies sung to children who were now grandparents themselves. They heard confessions of love, stories of heartbreak, and accounts of simple, everyday acts of kindness. It was the vast, intricate, unwritten history of a small town, a tapestry woven from the threads of ordinary lives. Ilara found her own voice in the process. She learned to edit the audio, to catalog the stories, to build a website where anyone, anywhere, could come and listen. She was no longer just the keeper of the archive. She was its curator, its storyteller. She was finishing her father's work, and in doing so, she was finally, fully becoming herself. The station was no longer silent. It was filled with life, with purpose, with the constant, gentle murmur of the past being brought into the present. The ghost of her father was there, not as a sorrowful presence, but as a warm and steadying one. She could feel his pride in the hum of the machines, in the focus of the volunteers, in the respectful hush that fell over the room whenever a new voice began to speak. She had not received an inheritance of money she could spend. She had received an inheritance of work that needed to be done. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was the greatest fortune of all. One crisp autumn afternoon, months later, a car she didn't recognize pulled up outside. An elderly woman got out, moving slowly, hesitantly up the new gravel path. She knocked softly on the bright blue door. Ilara opened it. "I heard," the woman began, her voice thin and trembling. "I heard about what you do here. My husband, he passed last week. We were married for 62 years. And I'm so afraid. I'm so afraid of forgetting the sound of his voice." Ilara's heart ached with a familiar sorrow. She looked at the woman's face, at the deep lines of love and loss etched there, and she saw a mirror of her own grief, made bearable now by purpose. She stepped back and opened the door wider, a gesture of welcome. She led the woman into the main room, now clean and bright, and sat her down in a comfortable chair. She went to a shelf and took down one of her father's custom-made wooden recorders, the last one that had never been used. She placed it on the table in front of the woman, its single microphone pointing toward her. The afternoon sun streamed through the newly cleaned window, falling across the console, where the small Kenrad tube sat in a place of honor, glowing with its steady, amber light. Ilara looked at the grieving woman, her face full of a deep and gentle compassion she had learned from the voices in the archive. She leaned forward, just as her father would have, and asked the question that started everything. Tell me a story about him. A place isn't the land it's on, it's the stories it holds.
I'm here with my other 7 personalities. Nice, Josh and Beth. Okay, we'll swing up to the top floor. Did you beat the game before you started decorating? Kinda yes and no, CC. I tried to restore things to like the best of my ability, but I was mostly just like focusing on just like honestly doing whatever I wanted at the time. They can follow you, yeah, Leo. Hey, can you power this on or something? There we go. I'll say, hey, Clara. That makes sense. Thank you. Also, hi, Julia. Good to see you. Hey, come over here. Turn this on. Help me. Okay. How do I make that garden terrace? Oh, thanks for the 10 TikToks, Josh and Beth. You're so sweet. Okay. Chair, table, light, or wildflowers. Oh, but these aren't wildflowers. Do these count? I don't think so. Okay. Maybe I'll make that in the like the OG area. Let's go back to our home base, and see what's up. I am go. Hope you have a great night. Oh, thanks so much, Josh Beth. Hope you do too. Okay. Wait, can you turn these on? Perfect. Yeah, turn on all my things while you're here. How long does that electricity last? Wait, turn on the bed. Yes, this thing. Beautiful. Okay. Okay. We'll need to work on that, but I'm like, do we have any more lamps or anything here? I don't think so. Not yet, anyway. Right, we were supposed to put the trash cans in and I forgot.